Well, over the last few days, more and more evidence coming through that the number of new cases of COVID-19 in our country is declining. The number of new cases being reported every night still hovering at around the 1,000 mark. Now, do you remember the sort of height of it, the worst of it, the surge of it? We had nearly 15,000 new cases every day, so really a big decline. There's still the question of where there could be a second wave of the virus. Professor Shabir Madhi, one of the experts on this, a professor of vaccinology at Wits University. Professor, good afternoon to you. I really hope you've managed to get a little bit of sleep over the last few weeks. Firstly, how would you describe where we are with this virus?
So good afternoon, Stephen. So I think we're actually in quite a good space in South Africa, despite the huge amount of infection likely having taken place. That hasn't really translated into the severe number of cases that we had anticipated of severe COVID-19, the huge number of cases, or highly excessive number of deaths. So in South Africa, based on the data that's emerging, up to 35 to 40% of people in highly densely populated areas might well have been infected. What we're seeing is a reduction in number of cases, as you've mentioned, that are reported on a day-to-day basis. That there is also a decline in terms of the number of tests that are being done. So we're averaging about 20,000 tests being done compared to about 45,000 at the peak. But more important than the number of tests and the number of cases that are reported is the positivity rate of the testing. And that has declined from 25-26% to roughly about 12% now. We usually want that to be less than 5% as a measure that we're doing adequate amount of testing and that there's limited transmission of the virus in the community. So we're still on the downward trajectory. We're not at the end of this particular outbreak, but the signs are extremely positive that we've weathered the storm. And in fact, we've probably been highly fortunate that, like I said, the large number of infections hasn't actually translated into huge amounts of severe disease, which was what we had expected.
One of the sort of strange things about this, and there are many things that I realize we don't understand, that you would have thought as the economy opens up, I mean, as South Africans, we're moving around more and seeing more people than at any time since the end of March. That would automatically lead to more people catching the virus, getting symptoms, going for a test, and being tested as positive. But that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, paradoxically, that's probably what did actually happen. But in some way, it's actually sort of accelerated the decline of this particular wave of the outbreak. So with the opening of the economy and with the greater movement of people, it's very likely that there was increase in terms of transmission. But there's something else at play which we don't fully understand. We've got some hypothesis as to what it might be that actually resulted in that increase in transmission not actually translating into many cases of severe disease. It's possible that there's some sort of underlying immunity which is providing cross-protection against SARS-CoV-2 in the community in South Africa setting and perhaps in other settings that are very densely populated. So this is a hypothesis we're currently testing. But the opening of the economy, you're correct, should have seen an increase in number of cases, but there were issues in terms of our ability to scale up testing. So we might not have picked it up at that point in time. But based on the data that's come out from the Western Cape, where they tested pregnant women, as well as studies that we've done in Gauteng, like I said, 35 to 40% of people in certain communities have been infected, which is way in excess of what occurred in any of the high-income countries during their first wave. But that hasn't translated into severe disease. And in a way, that high infection rate actually contributed to sort of expediting herd immunity, at least in the context when we were still using non-pharmaceutical interventions like face masks or physical distancing. So it's a bit of a complex issue, but the reality is that there was actually an increase in transmission, but fortunately for us, that didn't actually translate into many cases of severe disease.
It's so interesting because, I mean, you look at what happened in the UK. I mean, they're tightening regulations on socializing again. Now the United States, the nightmare there continues and continues. I mean, it goes back to all of those stories we saw back in March. Maybe it was the TB vaccine, the BCG vaccine, all of those things. Is that what you're testing now?
No, no. So there actually is some information in terms of BCG vaccination. There was a study done in Switzerland which actually shows that BCG vaccination during infancy doesn't protect against COVID-19. And that was really sort of based on empirical evidence when that sort of hypothesis was made. What we're actually testing, so there are other coronaviruses which you're familiar with, which we call a common cold coronaviruses, that have been circulating since the 1960s in humans. And there's some data, in fact, from high-income countries, which shows that people, in blood samples that were obtained before SARS-CoV-2 started to circulate, when they tested those blood samples, they sort of showed cross-reactivity against SARS-CoV-2, so presence of T lymphocytes, which were able to actually cross-react against with SARS-CoV-2, suggesting that there was underlying immunity, at least in a certain percentage of the population. So what we are hypothesizing in South Africa as an example is that these common cold coronaviruses probably circulate to a much greater extent, including in the adult population, in very highly densely populated areas. In Soweto, as an example, if you take a sample from all of the children, 20% of them will actually be infected with these common cold coronaviruses, which is studies that we've done in the past. And that exposure to the common cold coronaviruses might be inducing T lymphocyte immunity, and that T lymphocyte immunity might be providing some level of cross-protection against COVID-19. So it might not actually protect against infection with the virus, but it actually attenuates the clinical cause of the infection. So it prevents the infection from sort of evolving into severe disease. And that is the hypothesis we're currently testing in our research in it.
Sure, it's fascinating, so important. Professor, there are calls to lower the regulations we still have. The tourism industry wants borders to reopen. The Eastern Cape provincial government would like traditional ceremonies to resume. People will start to look at level 1. Is it too early to do that?
No, certainly not. I think in terms of the closure of borders, there's actually very little reason to keep the borders of South Africa shut because we've got widespread circulation of the virus in the country. We're not in a stage where we're trying to contain the spread of the virus. That's really when you would want to keep your borders shut. As an example, New Zealand or Australia or Iceland, where there isn't sort of wide seeding of the virus, which has already taken place in South Africa. So that's not the reason to keep the borders shut. So there's very little scientific reason, as far as I'm concerned, to keep borders shut in a context of South Africa, especially when such a large percentage of the population have already been infected and where the virus is still circulating. The number of people that come from other countries to South Africa is not in the hundreds of thousands. So it's really not going to make much of a dent in terms of what transpires over the next few months. But where I would still advise some caution is in terms of mass gatherings. And those sort of events, unfortunately, lends itself to super spreading of the virus. So over a short period of time, many people are going to get infected, and especially if those mass gatherings include people that are at high risk of severe disease. So those with underlying comorbidities. That actually probably is not a wise thing to do right now, and probably is not going to be a wise thing to do for the foreseeable future, at least the next 6 to 12 months. So that's something, unfortunately, I would be really concerned about if we start allowing those sort of mass gatherings. But otherwise, we pretty much could go to level 1 with very little impact. There is probably still going to be a resurgence of virus in South Africa, or even a second wave. It's difficult to predict exactly when that is going to occur. My estimate is it probably will occur after, in a new year, around about February, and that is when people come back from December vacations, during the December period when people would not be as adherent to non-pharmaceutical interventions. It will assist in terms of transmission of the virus, and consequently we might see another resurgence take place at that point.
Professor Shabir Madhi, really do appreciate the time as always. Thank you very much indeed.